Welcome, everyone.
Hey guys.
Welcome to the new and unfortunately probably long-term way that the Underqualified video show is going to look. I
We
am
figured
still,
you probably don't have enough Zoom in your life, so now you have
yeah,
even
we,
more.
we did a whole topic on why Zoom is bad, and now here we are on Zoom
Hmm.
hosting our show. But I am still in Colorado, and Benjamin is back in school down in Texas. And we weren't going to do an audio call and post that on the internet. So we are over Zoom. Welcome to our virtual backgrounds, all of you. Um,
I love that we you said I'm in Colorado and you have like the Northern Lights background, and I'm in Texas, but I
you got the
have
Golden Gate Bridge.
Golden Gate Bridge. I'm not in San Francisco, unfortunately.
But we've got what I'm hoping is going to be an interesting discussion today, more of just us talking about our personal opinions on things based on some articles, as opposed to just sort of regurgitating facts to everybody. Um, and that's kind of the first time that we've done that, really. So we're gonna see how it goes. I'm going to be talking about the difference between two different schools of philosophical thought, which is existentialism and nihilism. There's a lot of preconceived notions about nihilism, which is one of the things that I want to focus on, is how um, it gets portrayed inaccurately. Um, but then we're going to talk just a little bit about how we feel about those schools of thought, and then we're going to transition over to your topic. Do you want to tell them a little bit?
Yeah, and I'm gonna sort of talk generally about life's purpose and how we can find meaning in our day-to-day lives, if that's even possible. So.
Yeah. Well, and so this is definitely a matter of opinion, right? There is no conclusive answer to this question. So I'm not going to be providing like evidence in the typical sense, because normally I talk about stuff that tends to be more based in science. So there's like papers that talk about what is actually happening and what is actually going on, um, which is not going to be the case here because it's kind of how you feel. And so the evidence that I'm going to be bringing up is more along the lines of sort of how these schools of thought have conglomerated over the
Mhm.
years. But I did say that one of the first things that I wanted to talk about was the distinction between existentialism and nihilism, because there's a lot of inaccuracy in the way that nihilism is portrayed in popular media. And so the distinction between what it actually is and the way that people talk about it is actually something that I was not aware of. I have always, as along with most of us, have experienced sort of the pop culture references to nihilism, which is just a generally like sort of snobby, sad person. They say that life has no meaning, so it's all pointless. Um, and so I have this article pulled up from differencebetween.com. So we're definitely sort of straying away from our peer-reviewed sources here. Um,
Perfect.
but this quote says, "Nihilism is a school of thought that has wrongly been misinterpreted as a belief in nothing." Um, it's sort of the most realistic. It's brutally realistic. Like they have faith in absolutely nothing. Um, And so the more logical way to talk about nihilism is that it's a discarding of beliefs and values as they serve no real purpose, and there is no positive outcome to keeping beliefs really of any kind, um, which is different in that, of course, when you say that, there is no context to that, there is no connotation to that. That's just the way that that individual feels. It has sort of taken on the connotation of a very pessimistic outlook, in that there's no value to believing in anything. Um, and so it is derived from the word nihil, which that means nil. And so nil, nothing, zero, all of those Latin roots that we're all used to. And so again, it goes on to say that it's a theory that suggests no meaningful purpose of life. It's better to characterize nihilism as faith in nothing rather than belief in nothing. Excuse me.
Hmm.
Um, and so it's just a one word difference, but it's a very different meaning.
What do you think that like the faith versus belief interchange does?
So the way that they talk about it in this piece that I have pulled up right here, um, it of course goes at it from a theological perspective, because I think that that is one that we're all pretty confident talking about. Um, and so if you're a nihilist, you would not believe that there is no God. Instead, it is better to say that since it is nearly impossible to prove God exists, it leads to absence or low confidence in the existence of God.
Hmm.
So it sounds like semantics, but there is actually an underlying distinction between those two. And I would say that believing that there is no God is more forceful, if that makes sense.
Mm.
So you have formulated this belief and you hold to the view that he does not, he or it or she or they does not exist, as opposed to just saying it's almost, well, it probably is impossible on a human level to prove the existence of a higher being. So that just leads to your personal understanding that the existence of God is unlikely.
It's almost agnostic versus atheist,
Right.
sort of the distinction
Um,
that we're drawing.
and so this piece goes on to say that existentialists feel that they are not dependent upon their beliefs, but their actions. And even though there is little or no meaning of life, it is their freedom and responsibility which is needed to create your own meaning. It goes on to say that existentialism is pessimistic in nature, as it believes that life is uncertain, as is also our future. And it takes the individual to carve out meanings of their own lives. Thus, every person is a product of his own choice and action, rather than being a victim of his circumstances. Close quote. And so I would take issue with that definition a little bit, because since it is a school of thought, to say that it's pessimistic to me is inaccurate. It just is, right?
Hmm.
And so really the distinction between nihilism and existentialism is sort of the end of the sentence of the belief, if you will. So with nihilism, you say that there is no final purpose or outcome, period, that's it. And
Yeah.
that's sort of the end of the discussion. Versus with
Mm.
existentialism, you say that there is no meaning, no purpose, no outcome. So your actions take on a profound meaning shaping quality to your life. And then that's the end of the thought. So it's more of an expansion on the same idea. Um, and of course, I am not a philosopher in any sense of the imagination. That's just my personal opinion. Um, that, you know, you say, okay, you can hold that feeling that there is no meaning or purpose, but what are you going to do about it? Which takes in that actions thing.
Yeah,
And
I
while that,
agree with you there. I think it's sorry to cut you off.
no, go for it.
But I just think it's always dangerous to assign feeling to any factual conclusion, right? Because some people will talk about this idea that life doesn't have meaning as a very freeing concept, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you have the freedom of choice to find your own meaning, whereas others will say, oh, well, if everything's pointless, then well, now I'm depressed. So it just
Right.
kind of depends on you. I would agree with you that we should refrain from assigning a blanket statement about the connotation of existentialism.
Because and that's definitely true, because to sort of jump ahead in our discussion here, I would, up until this point, would have considered myself to subscribe to existentialism, just to tell you, because I've
Hmm.
talked to you about this in the past. um, and so I'm one of those people who falls into the category of saying, well, if life has no meaning and my actions are really all that there is to it, that's a really liberating concept, because sort of those societal standards for what you need to be doing at X point in your life really don't hold up if there is no meaning to life. So if
Hmm.
you are finding peace and you are finding happiness and you're not harming others while you're doing it, aren't you done? Isn't that the end of the discussion? So to me, that is a really freeing concept. It allows, you know, if you're happy in what you're doing, then just keep doing it. But there is a different article that I have over here, which adds in a third school of thought, which is called absurdism, which I have actually never heard of prior to reading this. And so this is by Daniel Miessler, Miessler, published on November 17th of 2020, so pretty recently. This is his personal blog that I'm pulling this off of. And so it goes into talking about existentialism and nihilism. It covers all of the same stuff that we just mentioned. And then he adds in absurdism, and he says that absurdism is the belief that a search for meaning is inherently in conflict with the actual lack of meaning, but that one should both accept that and then do it anyway. So it has, again, to put connotations to schools of thought is always risky, but it has more of a gleefulness to it. So you say, I realize that what I'm doing makes no sense, because if life has no meaning, then why am I looking for meaning?
Right.
Then you keep doing that anyway. And so he goes on to talk about different ways that different people respond to this realization. And I'm going to put somewhat of a trigger warning for self-harm on this, but not really. It's just the terminology that's a little bit strange. But if you do have, if you do struggle with that and that would be an issue for you, then maybe just skip the next couple minutes of this. And so he talks about these three different concepts, which is philosophical suicide, physical suicide, and acceptance. And I had never heard this discussion before, so it was really interesting to me, and I'd be curious to hear what you have to think about it. And so philosophical suicide is really dramatic, at least based on the definition that he uses here in this piece. And he says, such as completely embracing a religion or a spirituality framework because one believes it's too hard, too sad, or difficult to live on without one. So you get somebody else to assign meaning to your life for you because you get sad if you don't have one. Physical suicide is what you would assume. You realize that there's no meaning to anything, and it literally, it makes you want to end your life, which is sort of the rub that nihilists get in popular media, I would say, is it almost takes on this sense of self-harm or suicidal tendencies because the world has no meaning.
Like it's a synonym for depressive tendencies. Yeah.
And then the last one is acceptance, which you just continue on despite knowing that ultimate meaning is not possible, which is pretty straightforward. You just sort of take that for what it is and you move on with your life. And so he goes on to talk about Camus, which I read a book by Camus when I was in high school called The Plague, which technically qualifies as existentialist literature. And there's some discussion on whether or not Camus was an existentialist or an absurdist. And so this guy's personal opinion is that he views absurdism as the most satisfactory response, as it starts at a point of acceptance. So you say, I understand that what I am about to do over, the course of the rest of my life is not strictly logical, to look for meaning in a place where there is none, but I'm now going to do it anyway. And so what is interesting to me is that he doesn't strictly condemn adopting belief in a religion. He just wants the individual who's doing that to go about it from a different way. So he says that adopting a religion or some sort of nebulous, quote, spirituality as someone who has accepted the truth of intrinsic meaninglessness amounts to either intellectual laziness, emotional weakness, or some combination thereof. So there's a very negative connotation to that action. It is to say that the truth is too difficult to consume and accept, and that you've chosen to believe something untrue because it is easier. So he
Wow.
really, really lights people up about that. And then he says to commit suicide is to turn one's back on the beauty that life has to offer, which I feel should be explored in some cases. So I had those pulled up over the Zoom call. I'm going to get out of those now because that's really all that I had.
Mhm.
I disagree with the point on religion for a couple different reasons. The first is that religion has been and continues to be a great point of community and peace and love for very many people across the globe, and has been for thousands of years. Um, and you say, well, what about all of the issues with, you insert name of particular group here? And that is not to disregard those problems. I'm not saying that, it's great and that we shouldn't talk about that, because we should, but you can't disregard the peace that it brings to people who choose to subscribe to it. So to say that it's emotional laziness to me seems a little bit harsh.
Mhm.
Actually, it seems extremely harsh, because if you had just said in the previous statement that if life has no meaning and you accept that and you choose to find meaning anyway, and you find meaning in doing theological work, then you're just doing exactly what he just talked about.
Mhm.
And so in my personal opinion, I don't love that viewpoint. Um, and I'm sure that you would feel something similar.
I think
um,
that my biggest reaction to it was the idea that that was exclusive. That was the only thing that you could lead you to adopting a faith-based belief system
mhm,
was it was always laziness or weakness. That's the only thing that
right,
could take you there. It's like, maybe that's the case for some, but on the other hand of that, or on the other side of that, I would put a completely different spin on it. Because if you have struggled with finding a set of like morals and beliefs, and you haven't grounded yourself in something,
yeah,
and you choose to fall in line with uh, a faith-based group that is promoting positivity and love, right?
right,
That's that's the key point. But if you find your spiritual, ethical, emotional groundedness in a faith-based group, why I don't understand why that would be labeled as such like a flawed thing.
right,
Because I guess his idea is like, yeah, why don't you just do it? Why don't you just find your truth and live it, you know?
right,
And it's like, okay, but sure, I can latch on to that. But I think that, yeah, it's not a compassionate enough view of how people develop those their systems of belief, how people
right.
find their purpose. It's very sort of cynical and judgmental, I would say.
Well,
Um,
and it overlooks the fact, because it implies that every single person starts their life with a basic understanding of existentialism, which just doesn't make any sense.
sure. Yeah, yeah, I totally
and,
agree.
and there's definitely a certain snootiness to these. I won't say that. There is a certain snootiness to different types of people who subscribe to these belief systems. And I say that as
Hmm.
somebody who subscribes to one of these belief systems.
Hmm.
There, because the Judeo-Christian model in quote unquote Western civilization is so common and it is so pervasive, and it's something that we are all so used to, these philosophies can often take on a context of, well, I've grown up and I've realized that this is what I
Hmm.
actually believe, and therefore I have like risen above those of you who just accepted the warm, comforting rut that is the Judeo-Christian belief model. And I think that
Hmm.
that is an inherently flawed argument, because if a person is Jewish or Muslim or Christian or Hindu or whatever religion that they choose to subscribe to, and they are happy in that frame of mind, I think that trying to force your own belief system or lack thereof onto them, it flies in the face of what you just talked about of letting people find their own meaning.
Right, right.
Because, and that's not to say that you shouldn't talk about your personal belief systems. I think that we should talk about our personal belief systems in the way that we connect with our philosophy or our religion with other people a lot more. I think it would foster a lot better understanding, um, both within religion and across religions. Um, but there's a huge difference between conversing on a topic and trying to convert someone to your belief system. And that
Hmm.
goes, you know, if you're going to poo-poo Christians, and I'm going to keep using the Christian model just because it's the one that I'm familiar with. If you're going to poo-poo Christians for trying to convert people to be Christian, you can't then turn around and be like, well, you should really be an existentialist because it's the way that the world actually works. You're doing the same thing. It just happens to be different belief systems.
That's still projecting faith in something, right?
Yeah.
You know, you just have faith in your philosophical ideals as opposed to religious teachings. But when it takes on that fervor and sort of judgment of others, placing yourself on a pedestal at a higher level of intellectual understanding, then, or not necessarily, intellectual, speaking broadly about belief systems in general, as soon as you go to saying, this is what I believe, and because I believe this, I am better than other people, that's inherently when belief systems become damaging and dangerous.
Right.
Because you're othering people, right? You're
Right.
saying anybody who thinks differently than me is inferior, which leads to a whole host of problems that have plagued humanity for thousands of years.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. And it just, it's so fascinating to me that, I mean, we can't, and this is not to say that there are not really profound and peaceful discussions of existentialism, because I have talked with you many times about this. I'm a huge fan of the book The Razor's Edge by Somerset Maugham, which is arguably his most famous work. Um, and that is an existentialist piece. It's a pretty short book. It's under 300 pages. Um, if you're interested in any of what I just talked about, I would highly recommend that you go to your local library and check it out. It's a really quick read, really beautiful read, in my opinion. So it's clear that you can talk about your belief system with a certain reverence and still not be disrespectful. But that piece that I just read, not to put that guy on blast, it's his blog. He's allowed to say whatever his personal opinions are. It's his blog. It, he started out just sort of laying on the table what those systems are and how they work and how they are distinguished between each other. And then you could very clearly tell which ones that he fell into and
mhm.
which ones that he thought were okay. And I'm like, why can't you just talk about the benefits that you personally experience from whatever one that you subscribe to, and say, oh, well, and because of that, it makes it so much better than XYZ.
Mhm.
And that is the pitfall that I think everyone is so susceptible to, and myself included. I mean, it's really easy to say, well, this works really well for me. Why aren't you doing it? Especially if the person that you are talking to is struggling in any capacity, whatever it is that you're talking about. If you feel like you're trying to help them and the person is not instantaneously accepting of what you have to say, you're like, but clearly things are going so well.
Yeah,
Why would you contest that?
right, right. I think the flip side of that is that people don't always believe in something that is helpful to their mental health or their frame of mind.
Hmm.
I've talked to a number of people who will say, "Yeah, I'd really love to believe in God, but and I like try to, but that is not a connection that I've felt or a truth that I can um, that I've been able to wrestle with." And so that can be really agonizing to have this longing to experience faith and a spiritual connection and to have that void there. And so that person might still be agnostic or might still be atheist or and might believe some of these existential ideals, but really be longing for a belief system that says something different. It's just the way that they are, that they don't feel the connection with that particular school of thought. And so, and I think with existentialism too, that can be what you feel really strongly. And either, as it is for you, it can be liberating and you say, I have the freedom of choice, or it can be, as we've talked about before, very damaging as you say, well, then why do I do anything that I do?
Right.
So sometimes we just have a system of belief because we're trying to find truth as opposed to trying to find functionality, which makes things a little bit difficult.
And I actually, you mentioned the freedom of choice, and it brought this up in my mind from these discussions that we had in the existentialism unit when I was in high school, and the difference between the freedom of choice and the burden of choice. And it is the
Mm-hmm.
exact same thing, but for different people, it is very different.
Mm-hmm.
It's the exact same concept. Everything that you do impacts you, and you're the only person who has a say in it. And that can be totally freeing or completely panic inducing. And
Mm-hmm.
I don't think either of them is technically correct, nor is the other one wrong. But we've reached about the halfway mark, and so you kind of have a counter argument, but not really. It's just sort of a different school of thought. I think we'll transition over into the finding meaning in
Yeah.
various things.
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say that it's a counter argument, um, because I'm not saying that this is a path that you have to follow, but I certainly find that it's a very human desire to feel that our actions have purpose and like to feel that what we are doing with our lives is meaningful.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think there's room to navigate that within the school of thought of existentialism and finding meaningful moments and finding principles that you can center yourself on, even if you don't subscribe to the Judeo-Christian ideals of purpose. And so I want to talk a little bit about that and on an individual level. I do think that, and I certainly am a person of faith, uh, and there is a certain amount of like what the first guy was talking about like the easy way out,
Yeah.
and I still disagree with that, but I do sort of see why it looks that way because it's like, oh well, God put me here to do insert here,
Right.
and that's sort of the end of the whole crisis.
There's no more logic required.
um,
You've done
it's
it.
just that, I have found my purpose in spreading God's love throughout the world, or believing that God put me here to do a specific thing.
Right.
Um, and but also, there's disagreement about that among Christians. I mean, there's disagreements about everything among Christians because there are a billion different kinds of Christians. And so some people very much subscribe to the idea of God having a plan for their life and a very specific purpose that they are imbued with by their creator. And other people want to believe in a creator, but also want to believe in free will.
Right.
And so there's sort of that disagreement that maybe God created us, but he's not orchestrating every little choice that we make. And so there are different schools of thought on that as well. But I still think that it is easier if you are, and certainly I'm just talking about Christianity right now
Yeah.
because that's what I'm most familiar with. I'm sure there are other schools of thought in other religions, and that it takes on a little bit of a different character. But I still think that having that faith background does sort of end the discussion further because you just find yourself rooted in this school of thought that your religion prescribes. And so that raises the question for non-believers of, well, where do we go from here? You
Right.
know, where do I find my center if I'm a non-believer? Because certainly, you know, and some Christians will talk about this, that the removal of a god from society would make it impossible to have morality
Mm.
because there's no universal standard of good and evil
Hmm.
sort of ordained by a higher power. So it's like, well, if there's no God, then who has the authority to say that this is right and this is wrong?
Sure.
Everything becomes inherently subjective. And so some people will use that to perpetuate the idea that if you're a religious, then you are inherently amoral.
Right.
And I would not promote that. I think it's very, I mean, some of the most important and morally rooted people in my life are non-believers, and some of the most important and morally rooted people in my life are believers. And so that sort of flies in the face of that general idea that you can't have morals if you don't have faith, right?
That's sort of that thing that I saw. It's along those same lines that says if you require religion to be a good person, then are you really a good person? Which is a pretty hot take. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't know if I would ever say something that aggressive in a discussion with another individual, but it's sort of the opposite direction of the same point. You
Right.
know,
If
it sort
you're
of flips it on its head. Like if you can't be a good person without religion, are you actually a good person? Which is aggressive. I don't think I would make that point, but it's sort of the opposite in
right.
the same context.
Well, it is the danger of in any form of belief or centering of having a dependency
Yeah.
on one particular school of thought or one particular part of your life. I'm reading this book right now, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey.
Hmm.
And this ties in actually really nicely with Habit 2, which I just finished reading about. So the idea generally behind this book is it sets up sort of a bunch of different ideas that build on top of each other. And then once you've reached the 7th habit, you sort of put everything together
Mm.
in order to live an effective and principally centered life. And it's very interesting. There's certainly some things in it that are profound and some things that I would still take issue with. But
Sure.
I think that's the case with any philosophy on life because it's written by somebody other than me. And
Right. I was gonna say I feel like you should
um,
really feel that way about anything. You should
yeah,
have things that you agree with and things that you take issue with.
yeah, absolutely. But so in Habit 2, he talks a lot about the different areas of your life that people root their identities in and the various pros and cons of those choices. And
Hmm.
so, um, like you can talk about being spouse centered or so focused primarily on your partner in life,
Hmm.
which doesn't inherently sound like a bad thing, and I wouldn't necessarily say that it's a bad thing to be
Uh-huh.
really focused on your partner, but it is also vulnerable, right? Because if
Right.
you are centered in your relationship with another person, if that relationship becomes compromised, or if you're just going through a rough patch in your marriage, then that affects you in a very different way than if you're centered in something else and also have a relationship as a part of your life, if
Mm.
that makes sense.
Hmm.
And so like the one that was hardest for me to wrap my brain around is like to um talking about being family focused and family centered and
Hmm.
having that being bad.
Sure.
Because I've always thought of myself as a family first person.
Hmm.
And that's a good thing. But again, then if there's a disruption in your family life, are you able to respond to that in a different way? Are you rooted in something else that will help you to respond and correct the issues in your family life. So, and if you are family centered, and your security is founded on, I'm sort of quoting from the book now, if your security is founded on family acceptance and fulfilling family expectations, then your sense of personal security is as volatile as the family is,
Oh,
right? And
sure.
so your feelings of self-worth are sort of dependent on your family unit functioning the way it should, or your family unit being perceived by externally in a certain way. And so if that's the case, using the family example, then you might be liable to not address some underlying issues in your family dynamics as a means of not wanting to rock the boat, right?
Sure.
Because if my whole identity is sort of centered in having a loving home, then I'll just protect that.
Going to continue to
Even
claim that you have a loving home, even if you
right,
don't necessarily.
right, the optics and aesthetics of a loving home at the expense of actually preserving a loving home.
Hmm.
I think, and so that one was like, at first I was like, what's wrong with being family focused? But I sort of see the logic in that. And I think another one that is a big deal for me is being centered in what your peers think of you
Sure.
and deriving self-worth from being liked. That is certainly something that I struggle with as well. And so basically all of these things are you know, they're super common and they're not inherently bad,
Right.
but they're inherently vulnerable, as I said before, and less stabilized than being. It talks about being principally centered. So you come at it from that perspective. If you're having a problem in your relationship or in your family life, you say, "Well, I live my life in accordance with this set of principles, and so I will respond to the conflict in accordance with those principles, as opposed to just trying to rectify the problem."
Right. You
And
can
so the
weather a
idea
storm
being,
better a little bit.
right, the idea being that you're not as caught up in the preservation of the root of your identity, and so you're more able to actually preserve the health of your relationships. And so there are lots of things that people can use as their center. You can be work centered, you can be money centered, and there are like, I don't know, 15 others. So um,
Either
lots
of
that we
those
could
two
go through.
seems great to me.
Yeah, yeah. And you can be self-centered. That's sort of like that comes up a lot,
Yeah.
just culturally, colloquially. Um, and so that idea of being principally centered is great, but it still sort of takes us back to square one with where do we derive our principles from?
Mm.
And so some people take those principles from a religious source, and some people take their principles from, I guess, developing their own code of morality, or it's helpful to some to, and this book talks about it as well, writing a mission statement for yourself
Oh
that
wow.
is sort of all encapsulating of the way in which you try to live your life. I've been trying to think about that over the last couple of days, but it's not necessarily an overnight thing that
Yeah, it's not a
you
weekend
come up.
project kind
Yeah, yeah,
of.
that you come up with a creed that defines your life, right?
Yeah.
But if you are a person looking for direction and you don't necessarily find security in a set of principles or a set of beliefs or anything like that, then that can be a helpful exercise to
Hmm.
say, well, what do I, at my core, how do I want to treat other people? What impact do I want to leave on my world and my community? And how am I going to go about doing that? And so that was really interesting to me, and it's certainly a challenge that I will continue to explore. I don't have a mission statement to share with you today, but
You didn't do your
uh,
underqualified homework.
yeah, thinking about the meaning of life, and so I think really what that takes me back to is just the subjectivity of meaning, and um, we were talking about the subjectivity of morality and that being potentially like nebulous. Well, if you don't have a higher authority telling you what is good and what is bad, then how do we guide ourselves?
Sure.
But on the other hand, if you can individualize your process of finding meaning, then isn't that the most effective way to guide our lives? And so some people, have a very concrete purpose for why they are on this earth. This article that I pulled up quotes Mozart, saying, "We live in this world to compel ourselves industriously, to enlighten one another by means of reasoning, and to apply ourselves always to carrying forward the sciences and the arts." So that's very succinct, and I'm sure for Mozart that
It's really
that was
it.
pretty all encapsulating, was
Yeah.
advancing culturally in the fields of science and artistry, and he, at least in according to this quote, believed pretty wholeheartedly that that was his purpose in being here.
Well,
It's specific and it's simple, but it's also certain. And so I think a lot of people um, have this frustration that they don't have a I live in this world to do this.
mm,
And again, a lot of these discussions about existentialism stem out of a society that is more secular and more questioning. And so when that's the case, and we're largely coming at this skeptically and trying to think about life logically,
right.
it gets a lot harder to root ourselves. I guess what I'm trying to say is, if we're logically thinking people seeking emotional grounding,
Yeah,
that can
that's
be
sort of almost incomprehensible.
we're almost working against ourselves,
Yeah.
right? And uh, so moving on to talk about that, I think people also want to the idea of having a mission statement and a creed that guides everything in your life can also be kind of flawed, because people change.
Mm, sure.
And your excuse me, and your purpose for life right now might not be the same purpose for your life 20 years from now, might not be the same purpose that your life held a month from
Yeah.
now. And so people can look at that flexibility and that change that can occur and say, oh, well, I was wrong before. And I don't think that that's necessarily true. I think that your reason for living can evolve with you,
Mm,
and that a lot of times you might not have recognized this as your fundamental purpose because you weren't necessarily ready to pursue it yet. Um, I feel like a lot of in my 20 years of life, we're so funny. We're talking about this like 80-year-old men who have all this life experience. And it's like, I don't know what the purpose of life is for you. I don't know what it is for me. And, but at the end of the day, there, I think it's best to look at that and take a certain amount of encouragement and curiosity.
sure.
It can be, what am I going to grow into, and what's going to be my purpose at this point, and that can be a variety of things, and an excitement to discover that, as opposed to the dread of never finding it. And so
This
it's
sounds
inherently
it's
go
interesting.
ahead.
This sounds a lot like a movie that just came out, which is Soul. And
Yeah.
spoiler
Hmm.
alert for wee woo, spoiler alert. The end of that movie talks about how the, the purpose in life is to live,
Hmm.
and that's really it. And it implies a great joy in that. You walk
Hmm.
outside and you experience the beauty of the leaves falling on your yard, and the beauty of seeing your neighbor walk their dog, who they are just as alive as you are. um,
Yeah.
and how that's really it. But that could be a
Right.
hard concept to wrap your head around. You're like, what? There's there's no thing that I
Absolutely.
need to be
Yeah.
doing.
Right. And that's beautiful as well, to be at peace with your purpose just in your own existence. And I personally don't want to have a purpose for my life that is achievement based
Hmm,
or goal oriented. I still want to have my goals,
sure.
and things that I'm striving for, but I think that is conflating, um, a purpose with an obsession,
Mm,
if that makes sense. And so you sort of use these things as a stand-in for an actual solid understanding of what guides you in your life. And so it's, well, great, gotta get this, and then I'll get the next thing, and then I'll get the next thing, and then I'll get the next thing. And that is sort of all consuming. But
and
there's, go ahead.
that's a very it's a very capitalistic and it's exceedingly American viewpoint.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so, I mean, it is indoctrinated into us almost from the point that we can communicate. I mean, I remember in like first grade drawing what's your dream job, you
Hmm.
know, and
Yeah, it's like,
why
why
am
am
I
I talking
planning
about
for
that
a
in first
job
grade?
like
Hmm.
that? You know,
Even
and
like
talk about
my
wanting to enjoy life.
right, and like fifth grade continuation, even a couple of years later, you're like, where are you going to college? What are you going to study? It's like, I'm 12. I'm 12. I'm going to be a kid right now, and that's okay. Your purpose at that time is to be a kid, and
Yeah.
we should all just let that happen. But to kind of I thought I have this article pulled up. I think it's just some guy's blog post, but we'll give him some credit. See if I can find his name. Uh, Martin Van Dorn.
Nice.
I don't think he's an American just based on the spelling of his name. It's Marten for
Mm,
Martin. But so he sort of closes with, and this blog post is definitely about struggling with a feeling that life doesn't have meaning, and he's not a religious person, so he's like, well, if we think through existentialism, how do we reconcile ourselves to that reality if we're going to accept that life doesn't have meaning? And so
sure.
he has this, I think it's, again, succinct and profound. He says, in a very strict sense, nothing really matters, but that's not what really matters,
Ooh, I like that.
which I just thought was really cool. And so the idea of that, of course, being that we're not going to be able to give you a universal true answer that this is what the meaning of your life is. And in fact, we shouldn't, because there's a correct answer for you. And
Hmm,
that's a very individual outlook. It's not that life that doesn't have meaning, it's just that you have to discover that on your own, and nobody can tell you what that is. And so finally, there's a Thomas Huxley quote that this guy also included, um, in the article, and I think I'll close with that because it's really good. uh, the purpose of life is the purpose we put into it. Its meaning is whatever we may choose to call the meaning. Life is not a crossword puzzle with an answer settled in advance and a prize for the ingenious person who noses it out. The riddle of the universe has as many answers, and the best answers are those which permit the answerer to live most fully.
wow.
So, yeah, there's a reason that guys like that write about this stuff, and why I don't, because that's it's very well put and
Yeah,
very reassuring. And I just like the crossword puzzle analogy. I think
sure.
that's kind
Yeah.
of fun for an abstract concept. So anyway, that was kind of me weaving my way through to just end up saying, like, live your truth, man.
Hmm. Well, and
Find what's important to you.
what I was gonna say to kind of close us down here, which is crazy that we've been talking for 50 minutes already, um, is to I'm not gonna say challenge you, whoever is watching, but I'm gonna say encourage. We're gonna use more positive terms here. Uh, encourage you if you are watching this and you have been struck by any portion of whatever it was that we have talked about today, um, to consider what it means in in your lens, you know, Are you one of those people who really feels like you have a concrete meaning? I would love to hear what you feel is what speaks to you. I would encourage you to share with us if you feel capable. It's a really difficult thing to share in text because you lose a lot of that emotional connotation. And if you aren't comfortable doing that, just think about it. I don't think any of this is bad to just sort of ponder. Um, you can pull up the night the Aurora Borealis background that I've got going on and
Yeah.
find a little peaceful spot and think about what brings you meaning, if there is anything.
Mhm. Yeah. I love conversations that don't give hard answers, but make you really draw out your thinking. And that's sort of what I think a conversation like this does. It's an exercise in thought, but not one that is necessarily going to be to reach a hard conclusion. So, thanks for coming on this journey with us. It's been a little bit of a different week, but we were definitely excited about getting to talk about this. So,
Thanks so much, everybody. Take care.
see ya.